Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2022 Distinguished Contributions to Research in Education Award Lecture. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm going to be chairing this session. And as you probably know by now, the Distinguished Contributions to Research in Education Award is the premier acknowledgement of outstanding achievement and success in education research. Its purpose is to publicize, motivate, encourage, and suggest models for education research at its best. The 2022 Distinguished Contributions to Research in Education Award goes to Professor William H. Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is currently the Director for the Study of Curriculum Policy at Michigan State University. Many recognitions include being a Fellow in the International Academy of Education, an honorary doctorate from Concordia University, and being named a member of the National Academy of Education as well as an AERA Fellow. Its outstanding line of funded research examines assessments of math and science nationally and internationally. Dr. Schmidt is best known for his detailed study of math and curriculum across states in the U.S. and between countries internationally. If I may, I would like to read a passage from the nomination letter that puts in context the contributions of Professor Schmidt. Bill was trained as a quantitative methodologist with skills he has applied initially in advancing in statistical techniques such as analysis of covariance structures, and later in developing and applying measures for characterizing curriculum materials, education policies, and classroom practice. Bill invented and refined methods for characterizing elementary school mathematics content. Those methods were applied in empirical studies of how various policies influenced what content teachers chose to teach their students. The work was groundbreaking in demonstrating the dramatic differences in the content across the major standardized tests and curriculum materials, and as well as across state content standards. This work was the basis for broader adoption of the idea that a systemic approach to curriculum policy with attention to the details of content included could be a major lever for educational change. Dr. Schmidt is also a public intellectual. He's published beyond the academy, including prescient essays in outlets such as the Boston Review. Please join me in welcoming the recipient of the 2022 Distinguished Contributions to Research in Education Award, Professor Bill Schmidt.
And Gil, thank you so much for that. And I want to take the brief moment at the start to express my thanks to AERA for such an honor. I only hope I deserve it and can continue to contribute to the improvement of education and educational research. Also, this is a very poignant moment for me in a personal sense. I grew up in Chicago on the west side of the city, and I didn't really think about that until my youngest daughter, who, by the way, goes to U of M, not MSU, but that's another issue I have to face with my colleagues. She came up and she said, "Dan, do you realize you're going home to make this big speech?" And that really hit me. And so I really appreciate being able to do that because I'm a Chicago-bred Chicagoan and a city kid and proud of it. So with that thinking, I will move on and gladly share with you some of the most recent research we are doing in the Center for Curriculum Policy. In most all of my work is centered on mathematics because that was my undergraduate major. So the work that we're doing is around education, math education. And by the way, thank you for those nice remarks at the start. That really meant a lot to me. So what I want to share with you is the work that's going on right now, which I think begins to help us to understand the complexity of how inequalities have permeated math education and what they mean and where their strengths are and where the inequalities, where they originate from. So this is the first slide shows the what I'm about to say. which is, there we go. Pretty much what I just said, that one of America's problems is that with every test we give in this country, we always find some SES or racial inequalities. And it seems like we have no way of eliminating it, no matter how hard we try. And so these inequalities occur not just in our own country and our own tests, but internationally on the TIMSS and the PISA type tests. But this is not, in the next slide, this is not uniquely an American problem. Most countries around the world right now are beginning to recognize that those performance gaps they see in their tests are very important and lead to and foreshadow economic disparities within that country. And I think in today's world right now, the two combine to show that the real threat to democracy, as some of those basic ideas are challenged around these issues of equality and inequality. And to show you that, I want to share with you some results. We did a study of 63 countries, including the best sample of ever available to the West or outside of China. I worked in China for a while before the current atmosphere developed and was given the Chinese data set. And so we have 63 countries, including China. And I want to look with you at the issue of inequality, because I think it's a very important concept which is often misunderstood when you start talking about SES inequalities. I think people immediately think home and family background differences are what is creating these inequalities. But I want to broaden your concept of inequalities around SES, because SES has two components to it that are not often recognized. The next slide shows the model, a very simple, basic model that I use with these 63 countries. And you can see on this slide, there's a direct effect of SES on performance. That's probably what mostly reflects the school home backgrounds. But when you also have a curricular effect, a direct curricular effect on performance, and those two are adjusted for each other. But there's a third arrow there, which is often ignored or not recognized, which is that SES impacts the opportunity to learn. And if it does, it creates an indirect effect from SES to add to the direct effect. So that when you start talking about SES inequalities, you have to recognize these distinctions, because one is about backgrounds, which is more difficult from a policy perspective to change. But the other one is schools. Schools, the very entity societies invent to bring their children to a level of understanding necessary to succeed in society. And whether you recognize it or not, the whole area of mathematics, quantitative reasoning, is now, in my mind, the second great literacy. And in fact, it becomes increasingly more and more important, because think about how much information in your daily lives or your professional lives is quantitative in nature. Graphs, tables, all kinds of quantitative information. And therefore, this becomes a fundamental literacy that all children should acquire, not just some, but all. When you look at this model and realize that SES, that indirect effect, is really the public policy issue around education, because what it implies is that not all children get that literacy that is needed to succeed in today's world. They are given some math, but the math they get is dependent upon their SES. So the lower class children get stuck with the boring parts of mathematics that really calculators and computers can deal with much better than they individually can. But the reasoning, the ability to apply these concepts, that's the mathematics that all children should have. And yet we see in this slide potentially that this is distributed by schools inequitably. And to show you the point, I want to show you the result, just a few from that study where we did this and estimated those components with causal modeling. We estimated those components, and the next slide shows the results for several countries. Notice the variation. Sweden, only 2% of their inequality, total inequality, comes from the school. They have worked to make their system as equitable as you almost can, and only 2% is an indirect effect. But if you look at Australia, it's over half. Over half of the inequality is derived from the way in which Australia it presents opportunities to varying kids based on their social class. And in fact, one of the top performing countries of the world, South Korea, also has 54% of its total SES effect attributable to the indirect effect. And at the bottom of the slide, just to give you an overview, you can see that it's 35% for developed countries on average, but for developing countries, it's 26%. So there's a big difference between developed and developing countries in terms of the amount of inequality contributed by SES that comes from the indirect effect. And the United States, you can notice in here, is very close to the average for the developed countries, about, in our case, about 37%. But think about that for a moment. That's 1/3 of the inequality that comes from the schools who are part of the American dream, that if you come here, you work hard, you study hard, you can succeed. But the field of the playing field is not level, and that's the lesson one learns from this particular piece of research. So the United States, we already know from many studies that there is SES inequality in performance, but we also have another source of inequality, which is racial in its orientation, that black kids always do worse than the white kids on most of these tests. Now, we know that's true for total performance, but what I want to do in this study and share with you, as the next slide indicates, is that I want to broaden, we've well studied the inequality in the U.S. that comes from race and SES and the direct performance. But that those inequalities not only impact the performance directly, but they impact the other parts of schooling. We often ignore that these social class and racial inequalities impact the various other parts, like who's the teacher, like how much disturbance is there in the classroom, what is there at the system level, the support schooling. Those are all components of the process of schooling. And these racial and SES inequalities can impact each of those components. And as you know in causal modeling, if you impact parts of a causal system, it carries that impact through in other ways to other parts of the system, including student performance. So I want you to come to help share with you what we've learned applying this broader model as to where the different types of inequalities occur and which ones occur for which kinds of components. You will find some of these results rather striking and perhaps quite surprising. I know I did. The hypotheses that I might have had in my head were not borne out in many cases. And so what the purpose here is to show you where these inequalities have their strengths and which ones have the strongest strength of it toward inequality. And then we want to do that for both the system level, which involves the school, the neighborhood in which the school exists, and the district. And we also want to look at it carefully within the classroom, what some people call within school, where you have the individual teacher engaging the individual student, and we want to look at the inequalities in all of those particular instances. So, to begin with, the first thing we did is, by hypothesis and literature, is we wanted to find a set of variables that most broadly represent this schooling and to look at the various parts of it and how they interact. And to do that, we took and found five, as the next slide shows, we found 5 sets of data which we put together. As the piece of data gave us the outcome measure, civil rights data set, and Z as his national database, the district level survey data, and U.S. Census data. Combine all 5 of those. And through that, we were able to come up with about 20 components of schooling, relying heavily on Carroll's model of school learning, the work of Bloom and others a long time ago, who put together ideas of what are the major components that define schooling in the United States. And the next slide begins to show you some of the variables that we came up with from these different data sources. First, I want to describe the system-level variables, and there are these schooling components. And the first one, which we derived from the civil rights data, is what we call the school academic culture. Borrowing from my German background, it's the Zeitgeist. That is, it's the atmosphere of the school, which is defined by, in the civil rights data set, by looking at a snapshot of a year's worth of schooling and asking what percentage of the students in the school took what kinds of mathematics. And they found differences where most of the students are taking advanced math and others are still stuck around the first of the 2 years. Now keep in mind that the piece of data is for 15-year-olds. 80-some% of that are 10th graders in the U.S. And by the 10th grade, I would expect all students to be receiving the kinds of mathematics that they need in their life. Well, this variable is a very important one, as I will show you in a few minutes. You can read the rest: are disciplinary issues, teacher shortages, district funding, and we always have then the potential to look at the inequalities contributed. Here we have the percent Black at the district level, the percent Black at the school, and we have various measures of SES, some from census tract and some from just aggregating at the school level. The individual level, or the classroom level, the next slide shows, are the additional variables that we get from that level. Of course, the assessment score, and one of the most important and fundamental concepts which the last 10 years of research has shown, and that is that opportunity to learn. That we need, if we're going to talk about schooling and performance, we need to include what the content is. This for so long was not accounted for, taken for granted, and it was the American notion perhaps was that always it was the same. Every third grade taught the same thing, but that's not true. And that's what that OTL research brought back in. And if you want to talk about Carroll's model, this was one of the central concepts. And the research around it shows clearly that it's one of the most pronounced positive components in predicting student performance. And it's not just statistical. Think logically. If you expect children to be able to use mathematics to solve a problem, an application, and you give them no background in the area, that makes no logical sense. So clearly the central component, one of, if not the major component, has to be what the teachers and what the schools are teaching. What are those opportunities that those students have in order to succeed in life? And so we measure that as one of our key variables at this level. And you can see we also look disciplinary issues, teacher effectiveness, and also a second component of OTL is how many average hours does a student put into the study of mathematics outside of the classroom. In other words, homework. This becomes another central variable. And of course, we have SES, race, and gender on all of these children. Well, we took those 20-some variables and put them together in a causal model. And the next slide shows what that causal model looks like. I know you can't read the individuals, but I'll give you the highlights in a few moments. But the blue are the variables defined at the system level. The yellow are the woes defined at the student at the individual classroom level. But notice 4 boxes in there as opposed to square circles. Those 4 boxes are the core of this whole system, if you will. It's the academic culture, which is another sort of a system-level definition of opportunity to learn. Then the opportunity level or the individual student, all leading to student performance. We can pull those 4 boxes out, and the next slide shows the heart and core of the argument. That is that the question is, the hypothesis is that the academic culture influences the individual opportunities of students entering into that school, which then influence the student performance. And the question we're asking here is not only to verify that linkage, but also to ask, what does race, what of these components does race impact, and which of those components does SES impact? That's, I want to emphasize for those of you in the better quantitative stats backgrounds, this is not a separate fitting of a model. These are just to be taken out of the causal model you saw on the previous page. So the next slide gives the results for this particular part of the causal model. So the next slide shows that, in fact, 2 striking things, that the major component of inequality here is SES, which impacts the system-level definition of academic culture, but also the student opportunity, as well as directly the student performance. Race, on the other hand, has no impact at the system level on that, or on student OTL. That's quite surprising to me, and it only has a direct effect on the student performance. But you will see as the presentation goes on that this first analysis, although correct, and is run by the multi-level M+ causal model, covariance structure modeling procedures. So this is a correct representation under the first modeling we did. But I'm going to surprise you by doing some other things, which then begin to make the picture here much more complicated than it appears to be. But at this point, with this analysis, defining these variables, race seems to have no effect at the system level, whereas SES does at all, at both levels, as well as directly on student performance itself. There are many other relationships suggested by the causal model that preceded this one, and I will share with you the most important ones of those. Some of the ones that are absent are just as important, but in a short half-hour speech, I wanted to focus on the main ones that seem to be the most important in helping us to understand how this inequality has such a prevalent role that it plays for our American children in their performance and in the learning of the second-grade literacy, in my mind. The next slide begins to summarize this. First, we look at the system level. And here I remind you that we now first look at the schooling components, and we see that the district policy, regardless, that's absolutely logical sense. The district policy, whether you can count, if you take algebra in 8th grade, does that count as high school algebra? And that variable is related to the academic culture variable. In other words, the more it allows the children to take the algebra at earlier grades, the more the academic culture, the stronger the academic culture in the general sense is at the system level. We also can see that the math teacher shortage is directly related to opportunity to learn, which also makes absolute sense. If you don't have teachers to teach mathematics, the opportunity structure will be weakened, certainly. And finally, then, that school disciplinary issues seem to permeate down and affect the individual classrooms, which is, again, not particularly surprising. But here you then see these relationships, that school SES is directly related to the district math teacher shortage. And the neighborhood SES affects both disciplinary issues as well as the funding, the average funding per student within that district. So those are some of the ways, like, for example, that SES impacts. You can see multiple things outside of just the academic culture, the zeitgeist of the school. It impacts on other issues, such as basic as funding to as simple in one sense as disciplinary, the prevalence of disciplinary issues arising within the school. And of course, the disciplinary issues are implying a negative impact where the disruptions simply interrupt the opportunities of students to gain their opportunities and gain their knowledge in mathematics. Now we look at within the classroom level relationships on the next slide. And here we again see that performance, there are many direct effects of student performance. The ones we mentioned before, which were the OTL and the academic environment, those things. But additionally, you can see there are 4 more that have an effect: the teacher's quality, the disciplinary issues that arise, all of these other kinds of factors that direct impact on academic performance in mathematics. I have to tell you that, unfortunately, nowhere was there broadly available data directly from teachers. So the effectiveness of the teacher measure and the disciplinary issues, which is also a teacher management issue, those are the perception of the student, individual student, about his or her particular teacher. And that's would not most desirably, I would love to have measures directly on teachers, their knowledge of mathematics, things of that sort, but they're not available on a nationally sampled basis. But in one sense, I would think that in many ways, perhaps the individual student's perception of his teacher or her teacher in terms of their effectiveness may be a better measure of the teacher than it is perhaps to gain some other indication of how many math courses they had or things of that sort. But that, at least, I need to admit that those are not teacher measures directly. And for opportunity to learn, which is the key variable I've been suggesting, is very strong relationship to the student performance. You have problems there that, not problems in the sense that relationships, that you have the homework hours, which is actually a sort of, in my mind, a secondary related component to OTL. And that is because there's the age-old adage in mathematics, which is really true. You learn mathematics by doing mathematics. And so there's an OTL, another aspect of OTL that is significant to the OTL measure in the earlier diagram you saw. And the other thing is the classroom disciplinary issues and the teacher's effectiveness, both of which make sense, one in a negative way and the other in a positive way, in contributing to the opportunities to learn that individual students have. And again, here we have race, we have SES and gender as individual sort of variables. So this is a sort of a summary of what we found from that broad causal model that I showed you 3 or 4 slides ago. So there are very interesting absence of relationships like race, and there are very significant relationships, in fact, with the preponderance of social class in inequality entering both at the system and at the classroom level. So this bothered me as a scientist because so much of what the popular data and the performance data we get suggest in the United States the prevalence and importance of racial inequalities and that their impact on the performance of the students. So I questioned this and wonder why this came out the way that it did, accepting what's there because it was all done accurately with pretty decent measures. And suggested a pattern which also made a great deal of sense. But then in looking at this, I thought about what might impact this that would change these results. And so what I thought about is that, in the general model I just reported, the results from the SES was measured as a traditional instructional equation modeling from the pool within covariance matrix, which is then like an average over all the schools in the sample. And the sample, by the way, was a nationally representative sample. We checked the data against the populations, and it is very good. It slightly underestimates the number of students from predominantly black schools, but it is a believable nationally representative sample. And I thought to myself, well, if you take that measure, you're comparing that each child against the country's social class distribution. And that may not be the best way to do that. And so I came up with the idea, the team came up with the idea, my colleagues who play a major role in this and my students, we looked at and defined SES relative to the school in which you are looking to build this. In other words, individual schools' own SES against its own distribution was used instead of the overall one, which was used in the results I just summarized for you. And that the individual school SES distribution will be smaller. It will have a smaller variance because it's more within schools. You find more homogeneity than you do across all the schools, across a national sample. So when we did that and substituted, I did the exact same analysis as I just reported to you with one exception. I simply replaced the SES measure with the relevant SES measure within the school, not across the country as a whole. And a very striking result occurred. The SES measure, which was significant, as I just summarized to you earlier, was significant. That effect was reduced now in this next analysis using the more restricted SES measure. The estimate of the parameter was less. It was still significant. But what happened is that the race estimate of the effect became larger and was statistically significant. And in fact, race also ended up being statistically significantly related to the average number of hours put into the study of mathematics. So in other words, by changing one simple definition of SES and its distributional characteristic, that enabled allowed the race effect to surface, both in terms of OTL, which would then give race an indirect effect through OTL, through student performance, and the same thing with the average number of hours spent in the study of mathematics outside of class. So race now took up place, and it was no longer just SES that was having its impact at the classroom level. I think that then leaves a conundrum. I'm not sure exactly how to think about that at this stage in our work, but that leads to two very different interpretations as to what's going on, and so it leaves that open for further understanding and discussion. But also, and this shows you perhaps one of the life's things that I often wonder about, which is coincidences. Are they really coincidences? About the time I was doing this research, and I have to admit this, I had never really heard of intersectionality groupings, and I was asked to review a journal article from a sociology journal, and I didn't know anything about it. I wondered why they asked me to review it, but it was probably because of the quantitative background. So I figured, well, I better figure out what this is if I'm going to review it. I wish everybody that reviewed my articles would have the same attitude, but that's another story. I looked at that and read that article and was really impressed with I've forgotten the citation, I'm terrible with names, but a gentleman who proposed that you cannot look at the individuals, the characteristics of an individual separately, that is a splitting apart the individual, and that the cultural and the biological and other aspects of a human being should be treated together. And so I thought, well, let me take one more look and one more go at this analysis and define intersectionality. And I use intersectionality. I defined 8 groups, 4 levels of SES and black and white. And so we had 8 of those, and you have to arbitrarily define one of those for the cross-class, the contrast. And I just chose arbitrarily, in many ways, just white, upper middle class. And now think about this. And then I did this same analysis. I can tell you for the overall performance of the student performance, it was no different. It led to the same conclusion that race and SES separately or in that version would give you the same results. But where it changed was an opportunity to learn. And this being such a central concept of schooling, I was struck by this as where would it better be to look at this from that kind of point of view? Because if these are all 10th graders, and this is what it should be in most schools, basic math up to that point, and therefore those opportunities should be the same for all 8 of those groups, that would be an example of equal opportunity if every child in any one of those 8 designations would have the same opportunity. We would have equality of opportunity. So I ran the analysis, taking out race and SES, and replaced it by these intersectionality definitions. And the results were really quite striking, and really the short version of they changed the conception and how we think about these issues, making them much more complex and specific, and perhaps much more relevant in a deeper sense in understanding where these inequalities occurred. The next slide is to show you the results of that analysis. And there were 8 groups, remember. 4 of these intersectionality groups were significantly different from the white middle class, upper middle class designation. And those were the ones given here. 3 of them were less than they should have been. It would have been an equal distribution of opportunity. The black and the white lower, the black and the white lowest of the distribution the black lower middle class, those three were significantly different from the opportunity provided to white middle class, upper middle class students. And the last one, the white wealthy, that's the top quartile. That was a positive effect. But look at it in a different way. That is that the white lower middle class, the black upper middle class, the white upper middle class, and the black wealthy were all the same in their opportunity, suggesting a very positive result in terms of that. But also the other is that you have three that are lower, and that primarily concentrates itself at the lowest and the the third and fourth quartiles, the lower quartiles. So you see that is a mixture of race and SES when you look at it from this intersectionality point of view. And so I think this is another qualifying, confusing additional set of results from the initial one that we ran. So I think I'm left in summary. I've gone over a little bit, but let me just finish with a summary, which is the answer to the question of which of the types of inequalities, race or SES, has the predominant effect, and over what things did it have the predominant effect, at the system or at the classroom level. I think that what we've learned, one thing it seems, there is that definitely, I shouldn't say definitely, highly probable that the inequalities that exist at the system level are primarily driven by the SES inequalities. And for those of you that have looked at Reardon's work with this district level, he came to the conclusion similar, that he thought that the SES was the predominant inequality at the district level. And that's what this seems to be supportive of. Now, there may be other variables and other things that might be different, but at this point, that would be my conclusion. But when you get to the classroom level, where you have to really think, you have three different results. If you do it across the country as a whole, as a comparison, race is not significant on the key variable of OTL. If you do it when you go to the local definition of SES, you find that race is significant. And finally, when you go to the intersectionality approach, where you combine the race and the SES into a whole, meaning that's a whole person, you find then results, especially, I think, really striking and important around the OTL, where you would have hoped there would have been no significant differences from the arbitrary group, because at that point they should all be getting the same opportunities before they specialize in their last 2 years of high school. And yet that was not the case. But there was some good news and there was some bad news, and it's varied, and it would be very important to think this through. And at this stage in our work, we now have these three different outcomes related to OTL, and the job will be to fit it together and to put it together and make sense out of it in a substantive and in sociological way. And I think that what this shows is that the issue of inequality in the United States is much more complex than we sometimes treat it as, and it needs to be more carefully studied. And I think this OTL, this result that sits in front of you right now, is probably one of the most important things to better understand, because this is based on a full random sample of the U.S. schools, and it's showing these kinds of where these inequalities occur, which types of groups and which they don't. And it's not about black versus white. It's not about high SES versus low SES. It's a mixture and a very much more complicated and nuanced story to be told. And I wish that I could say magically, I know the answer and I understand it, and here's what it means. I don't. And that will take further research and further thinking about this particular issue. So I leave you with those thoughts. I think there's much to be thought about here and understanding inequality. And it's not just, and I would again emphasize this is the biggest thing I learned, is don't just think about it in modeling student performance. It's the whole system of schooling, which can be permeated by SES or racial inequalities. And those collectively then would probably help us to understand the student performance if we had enough of the right kind of variables. This is all we could do. These were the only variables we had. There are certainly others that would need to be included, but I think this points us in the direction that understanding when you get inside the classroom that it's really one teacher and one kid, and all of the things that could interfere with that in terms of opportunity to learn is relevant to understanding inequality in American education in mathematics. And I think, no, there is no more important issue to confront us as scholars in education, as policymakers, is to understand and solve this dilemma so that all children are given the opportunity. And if you want a good example, and I'm done with this example, sorry, I care deeply about this, and it just gets me going. And then I can't stop, but I'll stop after this example. That if you want the example of not fixing this, think about the pandemic, where people didn't know what divisor to use to do a comparison, and therefore they all came up with false facts. They weren't false facts, they were just different divisors talking about a different situation. Or when the model was updated with a new projection, they had no idea that that's a legitimate thing. That's not a false fact. So if you want to know what happens if we don't increase the literacy of our population, think about the last several years. The mess that created politically and medically and every other way. Every other way. Thank you very much. Upload. It. Code.
Thank you, Bill, for your outstanding and deeply timely lecture. We are grateful for all the contributions you've made. This is a wonderful example. We have time for Q&A. Before I do that, I would like to recognize the selection committee that identified Professor Schmidt as the recipient of this year's award. I was honored to serve on the committee. Lee Patel from Pittsburgh served as the chair of the committee. Arnita Ball from Stanford University. Elizabeth Moji from the University of Michigan. And Eva Baker from UCLA. And Kenji Hakuta from Stanford. Nathan Bell offered invaluable staff support to the committee. So thank you to all our colleagues for this service. Okay, I'm looking at microphones around the room. I don't see any, so I guess we can just raise your hand and I will acknowledge if you want to have time for a comment or a question. Yes, please, in the back. Thank you for that.
Opportunity to learn as a variable. I don't mean this as a bragging way, but a lot of the work I've done over the last several years is to develop measures to get at this. Originally, in the original TIM study, it was a very detailed study from the teachers as to what the topics they taught at which grade level for how many periods. The PISA doesn't collect data from teachers, so that wasn't possible. So for this study, OTL was taken from students where we asked them, gave them, mathematics is very hierarchical, and therefore you can put them in a certain You can use a certain number of indicators, and from that, what they tell you they took, you can tell how far they went in mathematics. So part of it was the student's self-report of how far he had gone in the study, he or she had gone in the study of mathematics topics. So it was based on that, together with the amount of effort put into that or amount of time. And all of that was based on that data we had collected from the TIM study, where we had much more detailed data and were able to construct an international sort of scale that would take you and place you at a certain grade level, depending on how which of the topics you had covered or not. So it was a combination of all of that that went into this definition in this particular study.
Does that help? All right. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, not in this study, but I did a study with numerous colleagues, and I can't remember how many countries were involved, in which we looked at the preparation of teachers and studied what kind of backgrounds they had, both for middle school teachers and for middle school, in high school. I don't remember all the details, it was quite a while ago, and lower grades. And we looked at the study, and what we found in the general statement is that this teachers in other countries, especially at the higher levels, had much more mathematics and in their preparation did American teachers. And that was also true at the lower levels of the system, not as strikingly large, but there was that in all of the other countries, there was more mathematics taught, as well as mathematical applications and examples and things of that teacher sort of issues. But they had a solid background in mathematics, much more so than do our teachers.
Thank you for that question. Yes, please.
So the human that breaks his life so finally how particular your discussion down will let black up there's that's very in and down the white or black actually and so
No, the category of that you're talking about the intersectionality, right? No, the definition of the SES levels was made as 4 quartiles of the SES distribution for the U.S. as a whole. It was for the collective United States population. So when it was if I'm understanding your question, there wasn't a separate definition for black, wealthy. That was the same. The wealthy part was the same for black and white. The cutoff, the criterion was identical between the races. It was just the national distribution of SES was just done and then cross-classified with race and white. Was that your question?
yes it just by different sure
They would be different sizes, surely. There would not be the equal numbers because it would reflect mainly the SES distribution.
Please.
so one per spike and then for one that's very for then that's only the god or and one anger how with the couple of us curious to talk about did they know it all of that.
I know we're talking about the algebra at 8th grade, but I wasn't quite sure your question.
But now for the spot it all the degree out all about this is that what's all is got you didn't know that high it is that does all night Dude, like that, it doesn't do that fire. They are. Should they be powerful with all like they got?
That's a real political question. I can tell you what I believe, and it's my opinion, nobody else's. I think, much like the rest of the world thinks, that you progress through mathematics, and by the time you get to 8th grade, you are beginning to talk in algebra terms. You are beginning to think algebraically. You are not, about through 6, you learn all the basic computations, all the basic definitions. And 7th and 8th, it should be, and I won't say just algebra. I would say this in a broader sense. This is a study we just recently done. We haven't published it yet, but we had 19 countries from around, quite a bit around the world in various places. And we looked at their textbooks at the 8th grade. And what we found is that a big gap, because more and more the countries are recognizing that mathematics is about reason. It's about being able to think logically and quantitatively. It's about being able to apply that to real-world problems. And so that article, that research, we're going to come out very strongly criticizing the absence of that and especially in the textbooks. And I think you as parents raise a ruckus between these awful textbooks. I'm a little off target but it gives me a moment to preach about this. And that is that we found in those 23 textbooks from those 19 countries, we found over 50,000 exercises collectively as a pool, if you put them all together. What would you guess? What percentage of those would be taking children into applying it to real world applications where they have to use reasoning and thinking? It's not a computational problem. You want to guess? Keep going down.
Oh, wow.
It's 0.25%.
Oh, my God.
So think about that. Of 50,000 ridiculous, idiotic. I'm terrible at arithmetic. You can ask my wife. I have to use my fingers when I'm at a basketball game, and the score is 27 versus 82. I just can't do it. So who cares? So reasoning is what we really need to do, and that's what's missing. And those books are doing that worldwide. And more directly, to answer your question, algebra is reasoning. It's a beginning to take and say, I know this and I know that, and here's how I can reason to find something else. And if that's what we should be taking, that's what they would have known more about the pandemic. They could have figured it out. They could have thought their way through it, but they don't. They think there's an equation that they have to use, an equation, and they don't have to. You can solve problems reasoning your way through them if the numbers are small enough. And so I think the rest of the world doesn't include algebra around 8th grade, and it's not algebra separated from other things. So this becomes a political issue because there are those that fight it thinking it's terrible, but that's because their image of algebra is not the correct algebra image. And I think if we actually stop playing games, political games with schools and saying you can't do this, you can't teach that, you could take this in lots of other areas where we're seeing in the newspaper about this. In one particular place in particular where it's really happening. Florida. I hope none of you are from Florida. I just insulted you, but anyway, we have to get past that and look to see what our kids need. And the rest of the world is beginning to figure out, as I said, that these problems and these gaps are hurting their economies and they're threatening their democracies. And if we don't figure this out and deal with this is going to end up with nothing good.
Thank you. Bill, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope you can stick around for folks to come and say hi before we all leave. Thank you again for joining us in celebrating Professor Bill Schmidt work and contributions. Thank you for coming.